All right, so a long time coming. This is finally the 2025 year in review. And looking over the list, I did a little scanning of the list. I definitely did not read that many books, especially when you take into account the fact that, with regards to nonfiction books, I started a new trend where I'm not necessarily reading them cover to cover. I'm just reading chapters now. I will read them cover to cover unless otherwise specified, of course. But yeah, I think it's 27 books. Yeah, so per the previous years, it was like 40, 30 to 40, maybe even close to 50. I've always been a pretty slow reader, but last year I did not read that much. So what of it though? What can you do? All right, so yeah, let's not balk. Let's just get into it. The first book, I think I read the majority of this technically in 2024, so a lot of this is really old in my mind. But I did finish it in 2025, and that is The End of the World is Just Beginning by Peter Zeihan. This is a nonfiction book. And this is a book that is basically, it's a geopolitical book, and it's this particular author, he's basically making predictions about the near future. So within the next few decades, where does he think the globe is going to look like? What power does he think is going to rise? What powers does he think is going to fall? And I've read a book by him before. I read This United Nations, and yeah, he's, I guess, famous for his prediction that China is inevitably going to collapse. Of course, they haven't collapsed yet, and he's been predicting that for quite some time. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see. But I think the most interesting thing that stuck with me throughout this book was his discussion of so called clean energy and, of course, its limitations. It was not necessarily an argument against clean energy. So he talks about solar and wind, and he was, of course, pro-nuclear as well. But in particular, he's talked about solar and wind and how, obviously I can't spout the numbers off the top of my head, but he's talked about how we were severely limited in our ability to power much of the world just based off of solar and wind, simply because certain areas of the world are not windy enough or they don't get enough sun. And these are essentially, he's not arguing that we should not use them. They're only ever going to be supplemental to the main thing, which he thinks should be nuclear. But yeah, that is one of the main things that I remember. And there's a lot of other things that are coming to mind too, but I think a lot of that stuff is just like further reading, so I'm not going to jump into that here. The next book is actually a fiction book. This is We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lionel Shriver. I actually have a review of this, so I'm not going to get too into depth. You can actually go watch the review. I'll link it in the description. I gave this book a 9 out of 10. This was a really good book. It's very character heavy. It's an epistolary novel. It's told in the form of letters. This is basically the back of the book description. She is basically coming to terms with the fact that she thinks she's responsible for the fact that their son, Kevin, went to school and shot it up and killed a bunch of his classmates. So it's very psychological and it's very disturbing. Right, the next one, it's a nonfiction. I just read chapter 9 of Consilience by E.O. Wilson. This is just a continuation of the same book that I've been reading on and off for a long time. In fact, I don't think I've gone back to it since. This particular chapter, he was talking about the social sciences, but the broader context is Consilience is about the need to join the social sciences with the, I guess you could say, the hard sciences or the serious sciences. There's always been this split when talking about human nature in particular. If you're all at all familiar with the sciences and the discussion of like gender, stuff like that, there's a huge divide in how the different sciences discuss these topics. So if you're in like the social sciences like social psychology or sociology, they're very ardent about gender as a social construct, etc., etc., etc. And the hard sciences basically argue that we are actually a product of evolution and that this could very well influence our behaviors. So we need to consider the possibility that there might be gender differences in behavior, etc., etc. And Consilience was an attempt to join these two things together. And this book was quite pivotal in that move, I guess. It's also pretty controversial because of that, especially his attempt to introduce sociobiology, though it was eventually rebranded as evolutionary psychology, which is also controversial. Either way, in this particular chapter, he talked about the social sciences. Admittedly, I can't remember all the specifics, but he basically talks about all the ways in which you can use evolution to enhance the social sciences. That's the general idea. All right, the next book is a fiction book. It's called Ohio by Stephen Markley. This is another highly rated one. I rated this one a 9 out of 10. I did not give an in-depth review of this one. I actually did a YouTube short. But this is another literary fiction novel, and it's a very character-heavy novel. It's not plot-heavy. It's just very rambly, very dense. And I just listened to it through audiobook. Same with the We Need to Talk About Kevin, actually. And I was really into it, though. Especially that ending as well. The way everything comes together at the very, very end is very interesting and fascinating. So this is definitely a strong recommend, and I'll link the short where I talk about it. All right, the fifth book I read the first 2 chapters, of course, is nonfiction, of a book called Secular Cycles by Peter Turchin and Sergey A. Nefedov. And this book is, I guess it's getting interest as of late, especially because of the way things are going, historically speaking. But the general idea is that history follows these several century-long cycles, where we regularly follow periods of massive population growth and then population decline. And they separate them into phases. So there's the expansion phase, the stagflation phase, the crisis phase, and the depression phase. And he also breaks it up into, or the 2 authors, they break them up into demographics. I just described the population density as it approaches carrying capacity, right? And of course, the subsequent effects of that, right? As it approaches carrying capacity, that leads to shortages in land and food. It leads to increasing food prices, declines in wages, declines in per capita consumption, higher rent prices, land prices, fragmentation of peasant holdings. Basically everything gets worse. Just think about it that way. It talks about, there's the demographic component and all the associated effects. Then there's the social structure, where there is one of the major components is elite overproduction, where basically a bunch of people are competing to enter the elite class, whatever that class may be within a given society. In the first 2 phases, they become overproduced. So like too many prepare themselves and they attempt to enter, but not enough space is there, right? So quite literally, they're just overproduced. Yeah, elite overproduction is in the name, right? And that creates a lot of competition within the elites, of course. And then, of course, there's political instability as well, which is driven by fiscal collapse of the state, essentially, where everything just falls apart. And one of the interesting things is this particular book that I'm reading, it applies to majority agricultural societies. It talks about population growth and how it approaches carrying capacity and then suddenly drops off. And one of the primary examples I think is covered in chapter 2, is the medieval England. So 1150 to 1485. And you're right smack dab in the middle, 1350 is the Black Death. And that marks the transition phase, the transition from stagflation to the crisis phase. Basically, everything's overpopulated. There's elite overproduction, all that. And there's all this crime, all this war, everything's overpriced. Everything's too expensive, everyone's starving to death, and then famine hits, and then it hits, and then everyone dies off, and that brings everything back down to a lower level. Everything gets cheaper again, and everything becomes more manageable. And that's generally how it works. Quite literally, this entire book is built around showing how the entirety of human history is just continually following these cycles, where population grows, then that brings down the population, that resets, and that starts the process all over again. And of course, there's a slight lag with the elites. They're usually siloed off from the rest of society, but they still go through the same process, but they're slightly cut off. And one final thing I want to mention is that while this is applicable to agricultural societies, this notion of elite overproduction, it applies to our society today. An example of elite overproduction is college degrees and people not being able to find jobs. That is actually the quintessential example of elite overproduction. Too many people trying to get into upper classes by getting degrees, and then there just not being enough places for all those people. We sold people a lie, and look where we are now. So it's very interesting, and it's just fascinating to think about people in a deterministic manner. It's also kind of scary because it situates the what is it, the 2020s and the rise of populist candidates and the increasing authoritarian tactics to keep down populist candidates and increasing political instability, increasing corruption. These models predict all of that. And that's everything that we're seeing today in the 2020s in America. And I know that Peter Turchin has written books that have taken his secular cycle models and applied it to America in the 2020s. And he predicted that the 2020s would be a time of great turmoil and political instability. So here we are. I mean, that's why I even read it in the first place. So, all right, book 6. This book was Norilska Groans by Michael Fletcher. I rated this book a 4 out of 10. I did write a review for this one, and honestly, in review, I was honestly just kind of confused by the book, and I felt like they needed to explain some stuff separately from the book itself, because I was like reading through reviews and watching reviews, and apparently they're explaining some like extra lore on the side or whatever. It was like, why? This should be in the book. So that was annoying. But yeah, I'll link the review in the description below. Right, book 7. This was House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. Right, I rated this one an 8 out of 10. Excellent book. Again, I have the review linked below, but definitely high praises for this one. I mean, it was definitely a tough read. If you've ever heard the phrase, I love having written, I don't like writing, this is one of those books where you like having read it, but you don't like reading it. It was definitely it was an interesting read. It's one of those books where you just kind of reading is an experience. It kind of feels like an exploration itself. It's not just a book you read. It feels like an exploration. That's the only way to put it. Book 8. So I read the first 5 chapters of Clash of Civilizations by Samuel P. Huntington. All right, so this is one of the transformative books written for international relations. It was written in response to the end of history by that one idiot, because clearly history has not ended, as we can see at this point. This guy has basically lost his mind at this point. But either way, the end of history suggested that if you could just make all states liberal, you could achieve essentially a liberal version of what Marx envisioned, where instead of having your communist utopia, you can have your liberal capitalist utopia, where states are not fighting. It'd be kind of like Western Europe, where, they're not killing each other. You'll just spread that around, and the entire world and reach the quote-unquote end of history. Well, The Clash of Civilizations was written in response to this. And basically, it suggested that there were different civilizations that made up the entire world. That there was Western civilization, there was Islamic civilization, I think there's like Russian civilization, Indian civilization, Chinese civilization. I can't remember all of the different civilizations he identified. I think he even changed it over time. And there's also different disagreements amongst people over like which civilizations count. And they're loosely defined anyway, so it doesn't like seriously matter. They're not meant to have like hardline borders, right? A civilization is basically a complex of like culture, a political system, a religion, an ideology, or a collection of all of these things that all like feed into one another. A people, all of them together. So like what is Western civilization? It's the economic system of capitalism. It is liberalism. It is our legal system. It is the Enlightenment. It is Christianity. It is and like there might be some contradictions in there, but like they all kind of like work together in some way, right? They're in conversation with one another at the very least. And that is the general idea. and Islam similarly. You often get into like debates over whether is Islam a race, or is it a religion, or is it a socio-political system. Well, under this framework, this model, was all of it at once. Maybe Huntington, apparently he balked at calling it a race, but like I know that there's like right-wing variants of this clash of civilization view that do lean on the race element as well, and they'll say that yes, Islam is a race, a religion, a culture, a people, a political system, a legal system, a way of life, like literally everything. A totalizing a whole civilization in conversation with itself, just like Western civilization is. Point is, he argues that this whole liberal democracy is actually hyper specific to Western civilization, and maybe to like you could spread it to like Japan. And he talks about like that exception and why that could spread. I can't remember the specifics, but in particular, he talks about Islam, and I think there's like this infamous quote in there about how Islam has bloody borders. And keep in mind, this was written in the 90s, so this is before 9/11 and all of that, and before the War on Terror, all of that. So this is a very prescient book. But basically, the general idea is this. There is no end of history. We're not going to be able to spread liberal democracy around the world, whether it's this left-wing end of history idea or neocon ideal, however you want to characterize it, right? At the end of the day, they're just going to be clashing civilizations. All right, next book. I read the first chapter of The Science of Human Intelligence by Earl Hunt and Richard Heyer. So this one was apparently the first author passed away, and Richard Heyer is doing the second edition of it. And I'm technically in the second chapter of the book as well. And I've already read a whole bunch on like just human intelligence in general. I've read a lot of books on just human behavior in general in the past. So this is me dipping my toes back into that. It's been years since I've done it. But yes, this was definitely an interesting read. It goes into, of course, how to define, how to measure intelligence, all of the controversies surrounding all of the misconceptions, especially within psychology itself and also within wider society, and then all of the technicalities surrounding it. Basically everything. Right, the 10th book, this one was a DNF. It was Shadow of the Torturer by Gene Wolfe. Technically, I was going to read Shadow and Claw, which is a combination of the first two novellas, but I didn't even finish the first novella. I could come back to it. All right, let me just say that. But man, I was not prepared for this. Let me just start by saying the positive things. I really was into the aesthetic. I was into the feel for it. I liked the overall idea of it. You know, the main character was cool. The overall world building, all of that was very interesting, right? Yeah, all of it was very interesting. But then it just got so mired down in all this confusing postmodern gibberish. One day I just like picked up the book and I was just like, you know what? Fuck this. I don't want to read this anymore. And then I moved on to a different book. I didn't look back. I even wrote a review, a DNF review. It was very inflammatory, so I sat on it and I didn't release it. And it's probably a good thing I didn't release it, because... And part of the reason I DNF'd it is because apparently there's no, like... I heard that there was no, like, neat stopping point between each of the books. That it kind of all just bleed into one another, that you need to just read them back to back. And I was just like, oh my god. I just want this to stop. I just want to, like, stop after the first one. But... yeah, so, yeah, so I DNF'd it. That's all I'll say for now. Actually, no, got a little bit more to comment on. One of my big problems with it was how the characterization worked. Like, this was first-person perspective. It's also retrospective, right? It's, like, written down. You know, it's kind of like, I'm here to tell my tale, you know? Like, there's one particular chapter that I zeroed in on in my DNF review, which was a good part of it. It was my less inflammatory part about it, where I talked about how in that part, it said that he was living grief with something. I won't specify what. You know, he just kept feeling this grief or guilt, you know, over something. And then he kept seeing it everywhere. He just felt so bad. And then, like, that was just like a paragraph description at the beginning of the chapter, right? And then, literally, the rest of the chapter, he just, like, a complete tonal shift. It just goes on describing the rest of the chapter. And just like, okay, they're just going about their day, and it's like this goofy, like, antics kind of vibe to it, and it just kind of felt off. It's like, weren't you, like, weaving in his, like, feeling of guilt to the actual narrative, you know? It was just annoying. I just did not like the way he was portraying the character. So that was something that rubbed me the wrong way. And that's aside from the fact that it was just confusing. And also, I didn't like the way he was doing philosophy. And this was the more inflammatory part of my review. And is the reason I didn't release it is because, I mean, I don't think I can comment on the philosophy until much later, right? Until I actually finish the series. I didn't think it was all that profound, right? Like, I just felt like a lot of the philosophy was just him, like, bleeding out, like, witticisms, and, like, the only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. Yeah, I'm not saying that's actually what he said. That's not, like, actually a quote. Let me just clarify that. It's just, like, witticisms like that. Except they're, like, poorly written, poorly worded, and they're really annoying, and you have to, like, stop and, like, stare at them a while. And it makes you think it's profound because you have to, like, stop and look at it and ponder it. But you're not pondering it because it's profound. You're pondering it because it's poorly written, right? The way he wrote it is confusing. Just like, this is fucking retarded. I'm going to repurpose my DNF review into my actual review if I come back around to this series. Trust me. If it's relevant. We'll see. Alright, next book. The 11th book I read. Another DNF. Hooray. Imajica, or Imajica, by Clive Barker. Alright, this one. Man, this one, I was really into it in the beginning. I really liked it when they were in the real world, right? When, you know, the magic was kind of like breaking through. It was like, they're very soft on the magic, right? But when they got to the fantastical world, things were starting to go wild. I was just kind of like, what the fuck is going on? Like, this is getting a bit too goofy for me. And I think the biggest problem, I think this is based off of what other people have said, most notably Jason Furman, whom I trust about this in particular. His character writing is just not good at all. In particular, his ability to write characters and weave their character motivation into the plot is shit. It is so bad. Characters just do things that are just baffling. And it's not very well explained. They're not very deep psychological novels. And that's usually what I want. So I kind of just fell out of it. Alright, book number 12 was, I just read the first 4 chapters of We Now Know by John Lewis Gaddis. This was a history of the Cold War. This book just essentially broke my back. I was trying to read it. I wanted to read the whole thing. I was listening to the audiobook. But I heard some people just complain it was the audiobook itself, and I took 2 shots at it. And I just kind of just stopped listening to it both times. Like, I don't know, it's just so uninteresting. I think he kind of gets lost in the technicalities. Alright, book 13. At Dark I Become Loathsome by LaRocca. I did not review this one, actually. I gave this one a 6 out of 10. Overall, I did like it. It was not amazing, but it was good, right? In fact, I think this is before I started giving half ratings, so I'd probably give it like a 6.5 out of 10, let's say that. And it was definitely dark and disturbing, and apparently he used to be like a short story writer, so he kind of like incorporated short stories into the book itself, and I thought that was actually like an interesting way to write the story. I like that. It was very, like, sexual, too. It was very kind of, like, freaky and weird. But there were some, like, weird parts. I don't know if I can talk about it without spoiling. Actually, it's not even a spoiler. It's just, like, this one weird... It was one of the weird short stories that were kind of, like, inserted into the story. Where it was, like, some guy falls in love with somebody because they have cancer or something. And it's like, I don't love you because of you. I love you because I'm in love with your cancer or something. It's like, what? Like, it sounds so stupid, like, when you put it that way, but that's literally how it was put, right? Like, the guy was literally in love with the person's cancer. And it's like, not only is there, like, a distinct lack of psychological realism there, because, like, who the fuck is in love with cancer? But even if you do want to go down that route, like, maybe there's a way to execute that in a way that's not, like, retarded. He kind of does it in a way that's kind of just I don't know, like, the way this story ends. He just kind of just comes out and says it. I remember there was just, like, a quote at the end. He's just like, "No, I love you because of your cancer. I'm sorry, I had to break up with you because I only loved you because of your cancer. And you're cured now, so I don't love you anymore." It's like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's like, yeah, there has to be a better way to write this, dude. You could have had him have, like, this, like, silent realization that the reason he was fucking this guy relentlessly while he was cancer ridden was because of the cancer, right? And then he doesn't say it out loud. He just kind of has this passive, or maybe not passive, but like a silent realization, like, holy shit. And then he, like, runs away in horror because of what he's realized, Like, that's a better way to write it. But no, that's not how he wrote it. But again, this is just one of the short stories that was within the overall story, so it's not like it damages the overall story. I think there was one plot contrivance at the very end. I can't remember the story enough to remember what the plot contrivance was, though, so... 14. Book 14 was The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. I fucking hated this book. I gave it a 1 out of 10. I gave a very detailed review explaining why. If you want to see why, just follow the link below to the review, and you will see in great detail why. Because holy shit, I fucking hated this. Alright, next book, 15. I read the first chapter of Leviathan and Its Enemies by Sam Francis. This is a nonfiction book. So this is a very interesting book about the change of, I guess, society in general. But it makes sense to start by explaining how the change in the economy. So we started with what he calls like a bourgeois kind of economy, right? Where there's this Protestant, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of economy where one person or maybe one family can create their own self-made family-owned business, right? And then that makes up the majority of the economy. It's just a whole host of very particular self-made businesses. And we have transitioned away from that to what he calls a mass society, or in this particular context, a mass economy, where everything's become bureaucratized. I started with the introduction of the railroads and all of these large industries where basically it was just incentivized to create all of these large bureaucracies in the economy to cover large scales, and then it extended out from there. So now we see these large chains. So now we have, Targets, we have Aldi's, we have Walmart, and those are all just a whole bunch of like groceries or, shopping centers. But they're all chain stores. So they have stores all throughout the country, all throughout the world in some cases, like McDonald's. So they're not like family-owned businesses. They're not just like a very particular place. His point is that this has had a profound impact on society because it did not stick to just the economy. It also moved into communications. I can't remember the exact word he used. I think it's communications, and this is just an umbrella term to describe everything from religion to, by religion I mean churches, mass media, to schooling, to any form of, communication, so talking to people. And then there's also the state, governance. So everything has gone from small scale to mass scale. So we have gone from a small particularized society to a mass society, a mass large-scale society, and he calls it a managerial society. And this is because these large companies, they are run by these bureaucracies that are run by managers. And you need managerial experience in order to run them. So it's all about managing these bureaucracies, and these bureaucracies in turn manage all of their particular sectors. And the state, in turn, has become joined at the hip with much of the economy, becoming more corporatized in certain sectors. And as I said, this has a profound impact. I think communications is a very important thing to talk about because moving from a very highly particularized society where, again, communications like churches and newspapers and stuff like that are very particular, going from that to a large mass scale society where everything has become, in his words, universalized, forces a singular vision on the whole of society. It is a universalizing vision. And it forces people to fight over what that universalizing vision is. So there used to be these discussions over, it's somewhat analogous to like, should states decide over something or should we leave it to the federal government to decide? It's similar to that, except in his account, there was this inevitable movement toward a increasingly universalized society where opinions have become more and more universalized because communications, the economy, and the state itself have all become increasingly in sync with one another and more universalized and joined at the hip. All these companies are buying each other out and becoming monopolies of one another, and is basically this inevitable march towards a single universalizing vision of what society ought to be. And it's basically a descriptive account of why all of these different competing visions of how society should be run got smashed or crushed out, and why the liberal universalist vision won in the end. It basically, in his view, it was inevitable. It was inevitable because they run these managerial institutions. They are the managers. They run the universities. They run the corporations. They run the media. They run basically everything. And they can control the messaging that goes out to everything. What was so interesting about this is there's actually two routes I want to take this. So the first thing is Sam Francis is a paleoconservative. So he is very much not in line with like a liberal universalist. He's very much a very right-wing thinker, right? And that's part of the reason why I wanted to read this. It's because he's very off-kilter. And his vision is essentially to take over these institutions to push his message, right? Just accept the way the world is now and push back. The interesting thing is, something has changed. Something has completely shattered. And that is social media. Social media has caused a fracturing. We've just talked about this universalizing force, right? Where before, everything has been particularized, and even media, newspapers were very particular, and everything was forced to become universalized over time. But that's all changed. Right, Sam Francis died in the 1990s, I believe. Or no, I think it was 2005. But either way, the emergence of social media has completely reversed the trend. And everything's becoming more particularized again. And that has allowed a lot of these paleoconservative thoughts to reemerge, essentially. And they were essentially crushed, forced to the side all the way back in the 2000s around the emerging like war on terror and stuff like that, because they were sharp critics of it, right? And so this just kind of shows a kind of interesting way in which you can at the very least like step away from like the values of the whole thing. Just an interesting way of how like society develops and how it shapes how different factions can win over time. Like the reason the liberal universalist won is quite simply because of the emergence of large bureaucracies. And then the reason the right-wing resurgence is coming back is because of the emergence of social media. And because Elon bought Twitter. It's stuff as simple as that. In fact, the rise of Trump and social media is quite literally why this book was published. It was published posthumously. So that's pretty interesting. Right, book 16, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This was rated 8 out of 10. So as you can tell, overall, this was an excellent book. It was very dark, very honest, and very disturbing. It was very brutal read. And if you want to see my more in-depth thoughts, you can see my review down below. Alright, so book 17 was The Dragonbone Chair by Ted Williams. I rated this one a 7 out of 10. And this one was overall pretty good. I think its weakness, it was a bit wordy, and there was a problem with like a lack of emphasis on politicking and stuff like that. And I discussed that more in detail in my review, so yeah, check that out. Right, book 18, Escape from Camp 14, One Man's Remarkable Odyssey from North Korea to Freedom in the West by Blaine Harden. Alright, this book, well, as you can tell in the title and the subtitle, was about a man's escape from North Korea. And I think the most interesting part about this book was actually all of the reading around it. First, it was triggered by the fact that in the context of the book itself, Harden, the author, had to admit that the subject of the book, I can't remember his name, he had lied about part of his journey. He had later admitted that he had lied, essentially. And then later, when I did even further research, he actually came back again and admitted he had lied even more. And so the version that I had read, the audiobook version, it turns out that version was inaccurate. I had to be updated further with like further reading. So it got me thinking on like a level about just the nature of memoirs and their accuracy. So yeah, that was just interesting. It's also just interesting thinking about North Korea, just how brutal and awful it is, just that country in general. Just thank goodness I don't live there, right? Right, book 19, I read Night by Elie Wiesel. This is another memoir. And this is another book that I thought of through the lens of the accuracy of memoirs. Now, let me be clear. The accuracy of like the Holocaust or whatever does not rest on this memoir in particular. Let me just get that out of the way. But I remember when I was listening to the audiobook, when I got to the end, there was like several additions to the end, like an afterword and like a speech and stuff like that. He gave like a speech at like Israel or something like that. And he like pledged his loyalty to Israel and stuff like that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. So I decided to check out some of the reviews to see. And sure enough, on Goodreads, there was a number of 1-star reviews there of people just saying, fuck Israel, fuck them for this, fuck them for their genocide. Yeah, like going after Elie Wiesel for this in particular. And I also did some other reading where apparently Elie Wiesel denied the Armenian genocide. So I thought that was interesting. Just always keep that stuff in mind, right? It's also mentioned on the Wikipedia page that the full accuracy of Nice is in question. Like this is mentioned on the Wikipedia page. Like it started out as like an 800-page book, and he whittled it down to like 100 pages. And like there are some like parts in it that come off as like very poetic. So it's like this is not like a straightforward telling of what happened. Certainly not. All right, book 20. I read The Long Walk by Stephen King. Right, I gave this one an 8.5 out of 10. I really enjoyed this one. This is one of the King's Bachman books, and I just love the concept of it. And I loved how he wrote it too. I loved almost everything about it. I discuss it in more detail in the review below, so you can check that out. All right, book 21. Stone of Farewell. This is the second book of Tad Williams' Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. I give this one a 2.5 star of 10. Man, yeah, I did not like this book. This was basically a middle book syndrome. All of Tad Williams' like worst faults just rolled up into one. Just so much tedium, so long-winded, so bloated. And I still have to read the third one. Yeah, spoiler alert for the rest of this video. It's not coming up. I will read the third one. I promise. I'll probably read it in 2 parts. But holy shit. My god. Yeah, if you want to hear more details, I do go into quite a bit of detail. I'll link the review below. Right, book 22, Rage by Richard Bachman, or Stephen King. I give this one a 7 out of 10. Again, I enjoyed this book. It was pretty good. I didn't like it as much as Long Walk, I guess, but overall I liked it. It's definitely his most controversial one, especially according to King himself. But I gave it a benefit of the doubt, especially since it's pre-Columbine, so I talk about it in more detail in my review, so. Book 23, I read In the Miso Soup by Ryo Murakami. I give this one a 4 out of 10. Overall, it was just like a meh, and it kind of like dipped in the end. It just kind of like pooped his pants. I don't know. I just remember in the beginning, too, that first part. It was just leaning on all these like stupid tropes. I'm just like, is this supposed to be scary? Am I supposed to be intimidated by this shit? Just like, oh, he has unnatural skin. Oh, he's scary. It's like plastic skin and it's like leathery and it's so dumb. I don't know. Right, book 24, The Rise of Rome by Anthony Everitt. This is a nonfiction. I DNF'd this. I didn't even write down the chapters that I did read. I was planning on reading this all together, but honestly, it was just slop. Like, I was expecting something more detailed, more educational, and it was just slop. I did not like it. Right, 25. Read Days of Rage by Bryan Burrough. right? This is another nonfiction book. This is a very interesting book because it was about the Weather Underground or the Weathermen, but also about a number of other like underground like terror cells that were broadly left wing. I say broadly left wing. They were all left wing, far left, extremist, like Maoist inspired terror cells that were in America late 60s, throughout the 70s, maybe into the 80s too, I think, from what I remember. I think the Weather Underground were some of the more significant. I want to focus in on them in particular because, I mean, what's most significant about all of this is like just how forgotten this period of history is. Like, in fact, I think that's part of like the subtitle of this book. It just amazes me. People talk about like the bias within universities, right, and how they're biased towards the left. Like the Weather Underground, they bombed the Capitol building, they bombed the Pentagon. And to be fair, like they weren't like bombing actual people. They would call ahead of time or they would make sure they were abandoned, but they were still bombing buildings and engaging in terrorism, right? And at the end of the day, they were not held accountable for their actions, and two of the known Weather Underground people, Bernardine Dorn, Bill Ayers, they became professors at universities. Yes, they became professors, and they taught students. These are the people educating your kids. That's what's so insane about this stuff. And it also helped highlight, once they talked about, like, I think it's the SLO? Yeah, or SLA, the Symbionese Liberation Army. It also highlighted a lot of the civil unrest with the black population, especially in prisons. Because the person who founded the SLA, he was an escaped prisoner. He engaged in incredibly violent and deadly terror attacks, and there were many prison riots in response to these things. And also, there are books like Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, who again were like these far left activists. I think Eldridge Cleaver ironically became conservative later in his life, which is kind of funny. But these texts were like circulating through prisons. Again, these prisons were incredibly riotous with these ideologies. So it helped put into context a lot of this stuff. And I talked about Assata Shakur as well, and how Tupac Shakur was the godson of this woman and how she shot a cop. So, yeah. It's definitely a very interesting look into that period of history, right? Especially, again, just how all of this is forgotten. This all happened during, again, broadly through the 1970s, and people just forgot about it. So it makes you think about, like, whether we'll just forget about Donald Trump and everything that's happening today because of just how insane some of this shit was. We'll see. All right, book 26, The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. I gave this one a 7.5 out of 10. Overall, I enjoyed this book. This is, as I mentioned in my review, this is my second book by him. First was the Knock 'em Stiff collection. And I talked about my problems as well. And I thought it was pretty weak in the middle, but the ending saved it. Those last 100 pages. So if you want to see my more in-depth thoughts, as usual, go to the link in the description. Right, final book, 27. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I gave this one an 8 out of 10. This was an excellent book. It was a very lengthy, very challenging read, let's put it that way. But it was worth it. It was definitely worth it. I absolutely love this book, and obviously I didn't agree with the themes, as I mentioned in my review, but I read it just because, of course, you have to read it just to be challenged, just to engage with the ideas, just to know what you're engaging with. So, yeah, this was just a fascinating read, and I loved it for what it was. So, yeah, that is a complete survey of everything I read last year. And I think this was a very, very long video. So we'll see what I can cut this down to, but I'll let it breathe too, so we'll see. Fuck all ya. I have now released both volumes of The Paths We Have Taken, which is the first arc in the Broken Reality. This is my grim, dark, epic horror fantasy series. It takes the political intrigue of A Song of Ice and Fire, the abrasive characterization of Abercrombie, the long-term storytelling of One Piece, and the philosophical horror of the Second Apocalypse to explore the human capacity for cruelty. Check it out if you are interested.